Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, the second of 3 nights on the Scots who built America, the frontier. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. Last night we crossed the ocean, the black houses of the Highlands, the ships at Belfast Lock, the long Atlantic, Philadelphia receiving the families with their bundles and their Bibles, and the seeds they had carried inside their coats for 2 months. The 2 dusks are still with you if you kept them. A Highland glen going grey, an Appalachian hollow gathering mist, the same sky from opposite ends of the world. Tonight we walk between them, down the road that connected one to the other. You do not need to be fully awake for this. The story will find you wherever you are. Let your breathing slow. The fire is already lit. The night outside is not hurrying anywhere. Neither are we. Chapter 1: The Wagon Road. Pennsylvania received them first. The ships came up the Delaware to Philadelphia, and the families came off the ships with everything they owned and stood on a busy quay in a city louder and warmer than anything they had left behind. Most of them did not stay long. Philadelphia was a door, not a destination. The Scots and the Ulster Scots who arrived in the 1720s and 1730s and every decade after found a city already crowded. Good land near the city had been claimed. The instruction, passed down the wharves and through the boarding houses, was always the same: go further. Further meant west, then it meant south. The land inland from Philadelphia was settled by German and Scots-Irish families pressing steadily along the river valleys, past Lancaster, past York, into the limestone country where the soil was good and the creeks ran clear, and the next family's clearing was only a few hours' walk away. But even there, more came behind them. The push did not stop. Somewhere in the 1730s, the movement found a road, or rather, it found the trace of one, a widened hunting path, a worn line through the forest that earlier feet had already marked out. It ran south. People followed it. The Great Wagon Road. That is what it came to be called, though no one named it that in the beginning. It began near Philadelphia and ran down through the limestone valley of Pennsylvania, then into the long trough of the Shenandoah, down the spine of the Appalachians, south through Virginia, and into the Carolinas. At its longest, it stretched more than 800 miles. At its busiest, it carried more people than any road in the British colonies. Not one wave, but a continuous movement. year after year, decade after decade, family after family turning south at Lancaster or York and following the line that the families ahead of them had already made. It was not a road as we would mean the word. There were stretches where someone had laid logs across boggy ground, what the road builders called corduroying, timber set side by side to keep the wheels above the mud. There were stretches where the route was simply a widened track between trees, the canopy meeting overhead. A family with a wagon and a team of horses might cover 12 miles on a good day. 15 if the road was dry and the children did not need to stop and the ford they had been watching for turned out to be shallow. Most days were not the best days. The wagons were heavy. Everything a family owned was in them: the iron pot, the tools, the seed grain, the chest with the good cloth and the Bible inside it. Children rode when they were small or tired. Adults walked. The animals set the pace, and the pace was patient. The Conestoga wagon was built for this road by German settlers in Pennsylvania's Conestoga Valley. Broad wheels to spread the load on soft ground. A curved bed so the cargo shifted toward the center on a slope. A canvas cover to keep the rain off. Practical in every particular. The Scots-Irish used them because they worked. The horses and oxen that pulled them were the heart of everything. A family that lost an animal to colic or a broken leg in the backcountry faced a choice between abandoning the wagon or waiting, weeks if necessary, while the animal recovered or did not. The road had its own kind of mercy in the form of strangers who stopped. Stopping was the custom. A wagon halted at the roadside with the canvas down brought others to a standstill. News was exchanged. A spare pin or a length of rope could be found. A child with a fever might be looked at by someone who had seen something similar and knew what to do or knew what not to do, which was sometimes more useful. The families moved in groups when they could. Not always the same group for the whole journey, since different families left different ports at different times and arrived at different points in the year. But on the road itself, company accumulated. A family traveling alone was a family exposed. The kin groups that had come off the ship together tried to stay together on the road. A cluster of families with the same surname, or the same home county in Ulster, or the same church back in Ayrshire, would camp within earshot of each other and move at more or less the same pace. Camp at the end of the day was chosen by the same logic everywhere. Water and wood near enough to carry, ground firm enough not to flood if rain came in the night, shelter from the wind if there was a hillside. The animals were hobbled and turned out to graze on whatever the clearing offered. Fires went up, several fires when there were several families, not a single great blaze but a scattered warmth, cooking smells drifting between the camps, children running between the wagons until they were called in. The sounds of a temporary settlement assembling itself for the night. The food on the road was plain. Cornmeal had replaced oatmeal as the staple for most families by the time they came down from Philadelphia. It was what the country offered, but the oatmeal habit persisted in a surprising number of them. Something in the body remembered what breakfast should feel like. Inns appeared at intervals, more often in the northern and more settled sections of the road. A tavern and a barn, usually. A family with coin could sleep inside, eat at a common table, hear news from people who had come the other way. The innkeepers knew the road as well as anyone. They knew which fords were safe after rain and which were not. The ford crossings were the anxious moments. A road that was merely difficult became genuinely dangerous at a river. The wagons had to go in loaded if the load could not be easily moved. The animals felt the cold push of the current and did not always want to go forward. Men waded ahead to check the bottom. Children were passed across first when the water was high, held above the current by adults who waded chest-deep if necessary. Older children sometimes froze at the water's edge and had to be spoken to carefully without alarm in the voice until whatever had seized them let go and they stepped in. Women managed the ford crossings with the same steadiness they managed most things on the road. The records that survive, the journals and letters, do not single women out as remarkable for this. It was simply what was done. The women drove wagons when the men were ill. They made the decisions about camp when the men were scouting ahead. A journal from a Scots-Irish woman traveling the road in the 1750s, quoted in later family papers, describes 3 consecutive river crossings in a single day. Her tone is matter-of-fact. The third ford was the widest. They made it without losing anything. She notes the good grass on the far bank and the clear sky toward evening. That was enough to record. The road passed through country that was, in the 1730s and 1740s, not empty. It was never empty. The Cherokee and Catawba nations held territory through which the road ran. The lands these settlers were moving into and through had been inhabited and shaped by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before any European ship made landfall. The Great Wagon Road itself followed routes that indigenous traders and hunters had used long before European arrival. The settlers walked paths that had already been walked. The valleys they found productive had been productive for others before them. This is not a footnote. It is part of the story of the road. The relationships along the road were complex and varied. Some were peaceable, grounded in trade. Some were not. The backcountry in the mid-18th century was a region where different peoples were all responding to pressures none of them had made alone, and the consequences were borne unequally. The record is honest about this, even when it is uncomfortable. A family coming down the Shenandoah in 1745 was moving through a landscape already in tension. They did not always know that. They knew their own immediate circumstances, which were hard enough. The wider picture was assembled later by people with the documents to see it whole. The families on the road were inside it, not above it. The road continued south. The Shenandoah Valley opened before the travelers like a long room. Mountains on both sides, the Blue Ridge to the east and the Alleghenies to the west, and between them a broad valley with a river running the length of it and meadows along the banks that stopped people in their tracks. The grass in the Shenandoah was different from the thin grazing of the Ulster hillsides or the close-grazed pasture of the lowlands. It was long and lush, and it ran for miles without a fence or a boundary stone or any mark of ownership. For families who had watched their fathers argue over boundary strips and pay rent on ground they had worked for generations, the sight of it was difficult to describe. Some stopped in the valley and went no further. They had seen enough. They took up land in the limestone hollows of the Shenandoah and built their cabins and their churches and stayed. Their descendants are there still, in the county records, in the churchyards, in the family names that appear on valley maps to this day. But others felt the pull further, south through Virginia into the Carolina Piedmont. The road continued because the movement continued, and the movement continued because there were always more families coming off ships in Philadelphia and always the same instruction waiting for them at the dock: go further. The pace of wagon travel is not a thing that can be fully imagined by people accustomed to distance measured in hours. 100 miles was not a day's journey. It was a week in good conditions. 2 weeks if the weather turned or an axle broke or an animal went lame. Distance was real. The children born during the journey were not a rarity. A family that left Philadelphia in spring might be still on the road in autumn, and the world does not pause its ordinary business to accommodate a road journey. The babies born on the wagon road were American children who had never been anywhere else, whose first knowledge of the world was the sound of wheels and the smell of canvas and the changing light through the trees. The road educated those who walked it. A Scottish boy who had grown up knowing one glen and one set of hills found himself moving through a country of different trees, different birds, different soil underfoot. He learned to read this new landscape from people who had already been through it, and he filed the information away with the same seriousness his grandfather had learned the names of every field in Ayrshire. The names the settlers gave to the places they stopped and settled were a kind of ongoing conversation with where they had come from. Aberdeen, Glasgow, Stirling, Argyll. Scotland appeared on American maps in small letters, scattered down the Appalachian spine, wherever a family with a particular county in their memory had put down roots and named the ground after what they had left. Not all the names were from Scotland. The road passed through country with its own older names, indigenous names that described the land's actual character rather than a settler's memory. Many of those names survived too, pressed into the same maps alongside the imported ones, the two layers sitting together the way the two histories always sat together, not comfortable but real. The inns on the southern sections of the road were rougher than those near Philadelphia, less permanent. A traveler's tavern might be a single room where a dozen men slept on the floor, or a barn where animals and people shared the space with no particular ceremony. The food was whatever the innkeeper's wife had managed that week. And yet there was hospitality in those places that the journals note with genuine gratitude. A fire going all night, a meal of beans and salt pork that a hungry family in wet clothes ate with more pleasure than they had expected. The Scots had always taken hospitality seriously, the obligation to offer what you had to those who needed it, and they recognized it when they found it. The evenings on the road, when the camp was made and the animals settled and the children fed, were the time for the things that did not fit in the wagon. songs, stories told to the fire. The fiddle that had somehow survived the Atlantic and the road both, that came out of its case after supper and made an unlikely sound in a clearing in the Virginia forest. The tunes were old, old enough that no one in the camp could have said precisely where they had come from. A reel that had a name in Scotland and no name on the road, that you played because your father had played it and his father before him. The trees received it without comment. The night settled around it. The children fell asleep. A minister traveling with his congregation would hold worship on Sunday if the road allowed. The Sabbath was kept as carefully as the road made possible. A flat-topped rock served as a lectern. The congregation stood or sat on wagon tailgates or sat on the ground. The psalms went up into the Virginia or Carolina air exactly as they had gone up in the Ulster kirkyard, word for word, tune for tune. The singing of psalms on the road was one of the things that held a community together when everything else was in motion. The words were the same words they had always been. The tune was the tune everyone knew. In a landscape where everything was new and uncertain and required constant attention and constant effort, the psalm was the one thing that was already complete. The road itself does not survive as a single object. It has been built over, rerouted, widened, renamed. Pieces of it exist in sections of modern roads through the Shenandoah and the Carolina Piedmont. The Route 11 corridor follows its course for much of the Virginia section. A traveler who drives it today passes through the same valley the Scots-Irish families walked. The record of those families is in other places. The county courthouses of Virginia and the Carolinas hold land grants from the 1740s and 1750s and 1760s, with names that are recognizably Scottish, carefully written in a court clerk's hand. A name like McDowell or Patton or Crawford, settling 200 acres on the South Fork of a named creek, is the road arriving at its destination. They built as soon as they could. The first shelter was often a lean-to against a large tree or a hillside, something that could be put up in a day while the wagon was still being unloaded. Then the cabin, which took longer. The neighbors helped, because the neighbors needed the same help in return, and the Scots-Irish understood this arrangement without needing it explained. The cabin site was chosen with care. A slope for drainage, a southern aspect if the ridge allowed, water within carrying distance, but not so close that spring floods reached the floor. The men who chose these sites were making the same calculations their grandfathers had made choosing a township site in Antrim or a house site in Ayrshire, reading the land the same way. By the time the cabin was up, and the chimney drawing, and the first fire burning inside walls that were their own, the family had been on the road for months. They had walked most of it. They were thinner and stronger, and more certain of what they were capable of than they had been when they left the dock at Philadelphia. They had also, without planning to, brought an entire way of life down 800 miles of rough track and set it up in the Carolina backcountry or the Virginia mountains or the Tennessee watershed. The church would come. The school would come. The community would assemble around the cabin the way it had assembled around the farmhouse in Ulster, the way it had assembled around the township in Scotland. These things were already in the people. The road just moved them to where they were needed. Let that settle now. The wagons are stopped. The animals are grazing. The fire is going. Somewhere south of the Shenandoah, in a clearing that did not exist 3 years ago, a Scottish family is in their first real shelter in the new country. The canvas smell of the road is still in everything. The children are already asleep. There is more road to tell, but not tonight. Let this be where we rest. The fire burns low. Outside, the Virginia forest is the same as it was before the wagons came, and will be long after this family's great-grandchildren have moved on. The creek talks to itself in the dark. The same sound water always makes over stones. An owl calls once from the far trees and then is quiet. The night settles in around the cabin like snow settling around a stone. Everything is still. The road south from Philadelphia has no name yet, not the kind that ends up on maps. It is a worn line through forest, widened by use, marked by the passage of thousands of people who did not know they were building a thoroughfare. They were simply going where the land allowed. The Shenandoah Valley opens ahead after days of forest walking. The mountains stand on either side, rounded and forested from base to ridge. The valley floor is wide and fertile, the river catching the light below. Scottish families, newly arrived, stop their wagons and look at it in silence. Something in the shape of it is familiar. They cannot name the feeling precisely. The mountains are not the same. The trees are entirely different, oak and hickory and tulip poplar instead of birch and rowan. But the quality of enclosure, valley held by high ground, sky given a frame, their bodies recognize it before their minds catch up. Some families settle here in Virginia and call it done. They clear the forest edge, plant, build a cabin from what they fell. Their children will know no other country, but others feel a pull further south and west, into the backcountry of the Carolinas, into the mountains themselves. The road is still going. They follow it. The Carolina backcountry in the mid-18th century is a different world from the plantation coast. Sparse settlement, long forest intervals between any two houses, creeks without bridges. A country that exists before anyone has organized it, before any court sits or any road has a name. It requires building from the very beginning. This is not discouraging to people who have already rebuilt twice, once in Ulster, once aboard a ship crossing the Atlantic. They know what starting is. They have the tools for it, carried in their hands and their memories, and a practiced tolerance for hardship that is not resignation, but simply competence. The first shelter is a lean-to, 3 sides of cut timber, a roof of bark and brush. It is shelter from rain more than cold, but it serves until the logs are ready. The first priority after cover is water, a creek nearby, reliable, not too steep to reach. A family finds its site the way a family has always found a site, by reading the land. Then the felling begins. Trees that have stood for a century come down in a morning with a 2-man saw and a good axe. The sound carries across a still day. Neighbors hear it and know a new family is clearing. They will come and help. That is understood without being arranged. The smell of new split timber is particular and not easily forgotten. Green wood opened along the grain has a sharpness, almost medicinal, that hangs in the air around a building site for weeks. It mixes with wood smoke and raw earth and the resinous scent of pine. People who grew up in these cabins remember that smell all their lives. The logs are notched at the corners and laid one on another, each course raising the walls a foot. The gaps are chinked with clay mixed with grass or moss, pressed in by hand. Light comes through anyway at first, thin bright lines between the logs. As the wood dries and the clay sets, the lines close. The cabin becomes dim and warm inside. One room, a stone hearth at one end, built from creek stones, mortared with clay. The hearth is the center of everything, cooking, warmth, light after dark. The smoke goes up a chimney of wooden staves daubed with clay, a precarious arrangement that must be watched. But it draws mostly, and the cabin is habitable. Neighbors helped. This is the detail that keeps surfacing in every account. Cabin raisings were communal events. Families who had met on the road 6 months earlier worked alongside each other because the work was simply too large for one household to do alone, and because the only reliable currency in the backcountry was mutual obligation. The Cherokee knew this land before anyone called it a backcountry. The hills of what is now North Carolina and Tennessee had been Cherokee country for as long as the oral tradition could carry memory. The mountain towns, the hunting territories, the paths between them, all of it was organized, named, inhabited. When Scottish and Scots-Irish settlers began arriving in the Carolina backcountry in the 1730s and 1740s, they were not entering empty land. They were entering the edges of a world that had its own structure, its own governance, its own long relationship with the landscape. That is the honest account. The early decades of contact were not uniformly violent. There was trade. There were periods of negotiated coexistence, agreements that held for years at a time. Cherokee and settler communities were sometimes neighbors in a functional sense, each present in the other's awareness, each learning the shape of the other's presence. But land hunger pressed steadily westward, and the agreements frayed. What a settler called an empty valley, a cleared place available for farming, was often a hunting ground in regular use, or a seasonal pasture, or the watershed that fed a downstream town. The categories did not translate. The misunderstandings were sometimes genuine and sometimes convenient. The Cherokee were not a single voice, any more than the settlers were. There were leaders who sought accommodation, who negotiated boundaries and signed treaties in good faith. There were others who concluded, reasonably, that accommodation was a slower form of dispossession. The records preserve both. Conflict came in waves. The Cherokee War of the 1760s brought violence to both sides in the Carolina backcountry. Settlements were abandoned. Families who had spent years building a farm packed what they could carry and moved back east. The displacement ran in every direction that decade, and no one came out of it without loss. What the records do not allow us to do is simplify this into a single story of innocent settlers and hostile natives, or the reverse. The Cherokee were defending territory, governance, and a way of life. The settlers were following a land hunger that the colonial system actively encouraged. Both things are true, the history holds both. After the conflicts, the settlements pushed further west and south again. The Appalachian chain ahead was not a barrier, but a series of passages, and those passages had been known for a long time. The paths through the mountains, the gaps where the ridges lowered, had been Cherokee hunting routes before they were settler roads. The Shawnee held country to the north and west, in Kentucky and the Ohio Valley. Their territory overlapped with the hunting grounds that drew the first long hunters south through the Cumberland Gap. Daniel Boone was not the first European to travel those routes. He was the first to make them into a road that families could follow with wagons. The Watauga settlements, established in the 1770s in what is now Tennessee, were on land that the Cherokee considered theirs by treaty. The settlers knew this. The record is clear on that point. They negotiated a lease with some Cherokee leaders and proceeded anyway, where the arrangement was contested. The settlers of Watauga formed their own governing compact, the Watauga Association. It is often cited as an early example of American self-governance, which it was. It was also a community governing itself on ground the existing treaty structure did not clearly assign to them. History is often both things at once. The Scots-Irish settlers had brought with them a tradition of living in the margins of official order. In Ulster, they had been outside the established church. In the backcountry, they were outside the reach of colonial courts. They built their own institutions because they had always built their own institutions. In this place, that habit had consequences for people already there. It is not possible to tell this story honestly without holding that. These were people who knew what dispossession felt like. Several generations of their own family had watched land change hands under the force of power. They arrived in Appalachia and in time participated in a dispossession of others. The pattern is not comfortable, it is real. The Blue Ridge itself stands between the Piedmont and the Western Country, a long spine running northeast to southwest, wooded to the summits in most places, crossed by a handful of passes. Scottish settlers who came over those passes found themselves in a world that closed in around them in a way that felt, again, almost known. High country holds weather differently from low country. Cloud catches on the ridge and lingers. Mist gathers in the hollows in the evening, thickening until the valley floor is hidden and only the ridgeline stands above it. Rain comes sideways in a west wind. The landscape demands a particular kind of attention, the same kind the highlands demanded. The mountains gave something back too, and this is worth saying clearly. They were productive country for people with the right skills. The forests were full of game. The rivers ran clear and cold and held fish. The soil in the valley bottoms, once cleared, was rich. A family that worked hard and knew the country could feed itself well. Corn was the crop that made mountain farming viable. It grew in the valley fields and could be stored through winter, ground into meal at the small mills that appeared on every creek with a reliable fall of water. A corn crop and a kitchen garden and a few hogs ranging the forest mast. That was a foundation a family could build on. The hogs were half wild. They ranged the chestnut and oak forest in autumn, fattening on the mast, and were gathered in at first frost and put up for winter. Salted pork, smoked ham, the rendered fat that served a dozen purposes. The forest was larder and pasture at once. A man who understood that arrangement did not go hungry. The fiddler in the family was valued. That is not a romantic statement. It is a practical one. A settlement that had music for its gatherings was a settlement that held together better than one that did not. People worked harder at a barn raising when there was a tune to work to. The fiddle was social technology. The tunes they played had crossed the Atlantic in memory because there was no other way to carry them. A man who had danced to a reel in Antrim or Argyllshire carried the tune in his fingers and his feet, and he could reproduce it in a log cabin in the Carolinas without any instrument's help. The music survived because it had no physical form that could be lost. Presbyterian worship continued in those mountains with a seriousness that sometimes surprised outsiders. These were not casual congregants. They had brought their faith across an ocean and a wilderness, and it had been the thread that held their communities together through every difficulty. The psalms sung in a log church in the Holston Valley were the same psalms sung in the kirks of Lanarkshire. A minister in those communities was a man of enormous practical importance. He kept records. He adjudicated disputes. He visited the sick and the dying over distances that might mean a day's ride each way. Many of them were educated men who had given up easier lives in established congregations because they believed their people needed them in the mountains. The records honor them. The children born in these cabins grew up knowing two landscapes simultaneously. The immediate landscape, which they could name hill by hill, creek by creek, the way their parents had named it for them. And a second landscape made of stories, the glen their grandmother had left, the town their grandfather described, a place none of them had seen, but that existed clearly in the family's imagination. This double geography is one of the stranger inheritances of the Scots in America. A child raised in a Tennessee hollow in 1790, who had never been further east than the gap she was born through, might nonetheless be able to describe the particular quality of light on Loch Lynn in winter, because her grandfather had described it to her exactly with the care of a man who feared forgetting. Evening comes down the ridge the same way evening comes down a highland glen, not all at once. The light retreats to the high ground first, lingers there while the valley below goes to shadow. The ridge holds gold while the creek bottom is already grey. Then the gold goes too. The stars appear over the eastern ridge before the sky to the west has finished. The cabin firelight is the whole world after dark. The children sit close. The day's work is reviewed, what was done, what remains, what the next day requires. Practical conversation, because every decision in a subsistence household has weight. Then, when the practical is covered, someone might tell a story, or sing a line of something, or simply sit. Sitting in silence was not a problem for these people. They had come from a culture that valued quiet, that understood the difference between silence that is empty and silence that is full. A Highland family in the evening, all the work done, the fire burning low. They did not need to fill every moment with speech. Neither did their descendants in the Appalachian night. The Cherokee towns to the south and west of the settlements maintained their own life through these decades, under increasing pressure. The records of traders who moved between the two worlds described towns with order and ceremony and a detailed knowledge of the landscape that the settlers, for all their forest skills, had not yet accumulated. Some settlers learned from that knowledge. The hunters who ranged deep into Cherokee territory knew the passes the Cherokee used, the routes to the rich hunting grounds, the seasonal patterns of game movement. That knowledge was often obtained through trade, through relationships, through the gradual sharing of information between people who were present in the same country. The frontier was not a line. That is a later simplification, drawn on maps after the fact to suggest a tidiness that was never there. It was a zone of overlap and encounter, managed badly by distant governments and lived in daily by people who had more complex relationships with their neighbors than the official record tends to acknowledge. A Scots-Irish family and a Cherokee family trading furs and corn at a frontier post in the 1750s. Their daily reality had texture and practicality that the broad history erases. People needed things. People had things to offer. The exchange happened in a context of larger conflict and dispossession, and that context was real. And so was the exchange. The land remembers things that the written record leaves out. The Cherokee place names that survive under the settler names. The paths that became roads because they were already the most efficient way through the terrain. The sites of towns that stood for centuries before any European map was drawn. The landscape holds more history than the history's record. By the time Kentucky opened in the 1770s, through the Cumberland Gap and the Wilderness Road that Boone and others cut, there was already a generation of mountain-born Scots-Irish who understood the interior country in a way their parents, newly off the ship, could not have imagined. They were American now, in some essential way, formed by the specific landscape they had grown up in. They were also still Scottish in ways they would not have chosen to describe, because it did not feel like a choice. It felt like what they were, the psalm at Sunday meeting, the way they raised a cabin, neighbors working together without needing to be asked. The fiddle on the wall, the particular quality of stubbornness under hardship that the mountain country brought out and confirmed. Through the Cumberland Gap, the land opened westward into Kentucky. Canebrake along the rivers, bottomland of extraordinary richness, the kind of soil that repays a season's work generously. The families who came through that gap in the late 1770s and early 1780s were not naive about what they were entering. They had heard what waited. The Shawnee contested Kentucky fiercely. The settlements at Boonesborough and Harrodsburg spent their early years in a state of siege that was not metaphorical. People died. Families who had survived the crossing and the backcountry and the mountain winters faced a new and sustained danger in that country beyond the gap. This is told without embellishment. The records are plain on it. The Shawnee were defending hunting grounds that their survival as a people depended on. The settlers were pressing into those grounds because land was what they had come for, and land was what they were told was available. The violence that resulted was the collision of those two realities. Tennessee settlements extended the pattern. The Watauga communities became the state of Franklin briefly in the 1780s, a self-declared entity that existed in the gap between North Carolina's authority and the new federal government's reach. Scots-Irish settlers, as always, filling institutional vacuums with self-organized governance. What is striking, looking at the full account, is not that conflict happened, but that the daily reality of the frontier was so much more varied than the conflict suggests. People built things, communities formed, children were educated, churches held their congregations, corn was planted and harvested. The ordinary texture of life continued around and through the difficulty. The mist comes into the Appalachian hollows in the evening the same way it comes into the highland glens. It does not announce itself. It simply accumulates, thickening in the low places, softening the tree line above the creek, until the valley is full of it and the ridge is an island above. The same physics, different mountains, the same quiet result. And the people who had come through so much to be in those hollows, who had lost homelands and family members and the whole familiar fabric of the world they grew up in, they had made something here, not perfect, not without shadow, something real built with their hands in a place that was now undeniably home. Let the mountains hold all of it tonight, the grief that was real, the work that was real, the acknowledgement of what the land cost in lives and in the lives of people who were already here. None of it undone, none of it papered over, just held the way mountains hold everything without judgment for as long as the stone lasts. The fire in the cabin is low. Outside, the ridge is dark against a sky just beginning to show stars. The creek is somewhere below, running over its stones, indifferent to the century, the same as it was and the same as it will be. Settle in. The mountains are patient. You can rest here. When the revolution came, it did not arrive as a clean choice. It arrived the way a storm arrives over a glen, slowly, then all at once. And the Scots in America found themselves on both sides of it. The colony of North Carolina held two Scottish worlds by the 1770s. In the Tidewater and the Cape Fear Valley, Highland immigrants, many arrived within the last decade, had put down careful roots. In the backcountry and the mountain Piedmont, Scots-Irish families 2 and 3 generations deep had built something they considered their own. These were not the same people, though the names on both sides were Scottish. They had come at different times, from different places, carrying different memories of what authority had done to them and what they owed in return. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what an oath meant to a recently arrived Highlander in 1775. It was not a formality, it was a covenant, a word given publicly before witnesses, before God. A man who broke his oath was a man who had broken himself. Many of the Highland settlers in the Cape Fear Valley had taken oaths to the crown on arrival as a condition of the land grants that had brought them there. Some had been soldiers. Some were veterans of regiments that had served the crown after Culloden. They knew which side had defeated them. They had made their peace with that defeat and sworn accordingly. When the Continental Congress and the Patriot Committees began asking for new oaths, some of these men refused, not from cruelty, not from a love of empire as an abstract principle, because they had already sworn, because the word once given was the only thing a displaced man owned that could not be cleared off the land. There is a woman named Flora MacDonald in this story, and she is worth naming honestly. She was already famous before she reached North Carolina in 1774. She had helped the young pretender escape after Culloden, an act of courage and considerable risk. She was celebrated for it in Scotland. She came to the Cape Fear with her husband, Alan, and her reputation. Flora MacDonald's presence in North Carolina carried weight in the Highland community. When her husband and the Loyalist leadership began organizing in 1775, her name lent the cause a dignity it might not otherwise have had. The records suggest she addressed settlers directly, asking them to remember their oaths. She was not a villain. She was a woman who had spent her life making choices under pressure and who read the situation according to the values that had shaped her. She was also wrong about what was coming. Most people caught in the middle of a civil war are. The Loyalist organization in the Cape Fear took shape through the autumn and winter of 1775. Broadswords were brought out from storage, drums beaten, a force assembled that was, in the main, men who had been in America for a short time and still thought in terms of the world they had left. Some of those men had already been soldiers once before in the 7 Years' War in Highland regiments that had served the crown in these same American colonies. They had fought beside British officers, eaten British rations, slept in British encampments. That experience was not nothing. It shaped what loyalty felt like in the body. The plan was to march to the coast, link up with British naval and land forces, and secure North Carolina for the crown before the rebellion could fully form. It was a sound enough plan on paper. The Patriots already knew about it. Moores Creek Bridge, February 27th, 1776. A February morning in the North Carolina lowlands. Cold, damp, the kind of morning where the mist sits in the creek bottoms and the trees are still bare. The Loyalist Highland force, roughly 1,500 men, approaches the bridge expecting to cross unopposed. The Patriots had reached it first. They had removed the planking from the bridge and greased the 2 log stringers that remained. Their artillery waited on the far bank. The confrontation was brief. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes of active exchange. The Loyalist advance collapsed before the bridge. The men who had been in America less than a year, who had not yet learned the shape of this particular landscape, turned back into a morning that had already decided against them. The records list the names of those taken prisoner, Scottish names, most of them. Some had arrived in the colony within the previous 18 months. They had barely had time to plant a crop before the war came to find them. The revolution asked them to unknow every framework they had brought across the water. Moores Creek ended the organized Loyalist cause in North Carolina. It did not end the divided loyalties. Those would go on for another 7 years, expressed in ambushes and burnings, and the particular savagery of a civil war where enemies are also former neighbors. Now come west, into the backcountry, into the Scots-Irish settlements along the Yadkin and the Catawba and the mountain creeks of the Carolina Piedmont. Here the feeling about the crown was different. Here the memory of the proclamation of 1763 was still fresh. The proclamation had drawn a line along the Appalachian ridge and said, "No settlement west of this." For a family that had crossed the Atlantic specifically to escape the reach of landlords and proclamations, this felt like exactly what they had left. The same hand on the collar, the same authority telling them where they could and could not build their lives. They had not come this far to be managed. That was the kernel of it. The Scots-Irish in the backcountry had been squeezed in Scotland, then squeezed in Ulster, then crossed the Atlantic and found a country that seemed, finally, to offer room. The Crown's attempt to limit westward movement felt personal in a way that perhaps it did not feel to those who had not moved so many times already. There was something else the backcountry settlers understood about the land they had built on. It was not, and had never been, empty. The Cherokee Nation held territory that the new settlements pressed against and often into. The relationship was tense, sometimes violent, and the Crown's policy had attempted to create a buffer between the settlers and the Cherokee lands. To many backcountry settlers, the proclamation line felt like a restriction placed on them at the expense of their ambitions. What it also was, seen from the other side, was an attempt to honor treaty obligations to the Cherokee. The line was being crossed in both directions, and everyone knew it. The Cherokee fought their own war in this period, allying with the Crown in 1776 and raiding the backcountry settlements that had pushed furthest into contested territory. The Patriot militias responded with campaigns that were brutal in their scope. These were not clean, separable conflicts. The Revolution in the South was multiple wars layered on top of each other, all happening at once in the same hills. By 1780, the Southern campaign of the Revolution had become what it had always been beneath the surface, a civil war. British forces under Cornwallis had moved up through the Carolinas. Loyalist militia and Patriot militia were fighting each other in the countryside while the regular armies moved around them. Neighbors burned each other's farms. Kin rode past each other on opposite sides of roads. In October 1780, a British officer named Patrick Ferguson sent a message to the over-mountain men, the Scots-Irish settlers on the far side of the Appalachians in what would become Tennessee. He told them that if they did not stop their patriot activities, he would march his army over the mountains and lay their settlements to waste. It was a threat with the wrong effect on the wrong people. These were men who had already moved twice, whose grandfathers had been told in Scotland and again in Ulster that the land they worked could be taken from them. They had not come over the mountains to be threatened by a crown officer into obedience. The over-mountain men assembled at Sycamore Shoals in late September. The records suggest roughly 1,000 men gathered from communities along the Watauga, the Nolichucky, the Holston. They crossed the mountains in early October. Some accounts describe them singing psalms as they marched. The old country was not so far behind them. Kings Mountain, October 7th, 1780, a forested ridge on the border of the Carolinas. Ferguson had positioned his loyalist force on the summit, believing the wooded slopes would slow any attack. He was right about the slopes. He had not fully accounted for men raised in exactly that kind of terrain. The Patriot force surrounded the hill and came up through the trees using the cover that forest fighting demanded. The battle lasted roughly an hour. Ferguson was killed. His force of roughly 1,000 men, almost entirely American loyalists rather than British regulars, surrendered or fled. The records note something that is important to hold without flinching. The Patriot force and the Loyalist force at Kings Mountain were both, in the main, Scots-Irish and Scottish settlers. Some men on opposing sides carried the same surnames. Some had come through the same port of embarkation years before. A few may have been distant kin. This was not an abstraction. It was the face of civil war at its most intimate. A man who had grown up hearing the same stories, the same psalm tunes, the same dialect, might find the man in his gun sights had a name he recognized from a different county, a different congregation, a different choice made at a crossroads some years back. History is careful here. The spine of this conflict was not simply Highland loyalist against Scots-Irish patriot, though that pattern was real and documented. It was more tangled. There were Scots-Irish men among the loyalists. There were Highland settlers who fought for the patriot cause quietly without the drama of Moores Creek. The alignments followed local politics, land disputes, religion, and sometimes simply which side arrived in the community first with a persuasive argument. There were families where a father held one position and a son held the other. The records suggest this was sometimes ideological and sometimes practical. A son who had grown up entirely in America might feel the pull of independence more naturally than a father whose formative years had been in Scotland. Sometimes it was about a specific land grant, a specific grievance with a specific officer, a specific promise made by a specific man in a tavern. What was it to be a man who had already been displaced once, already crossed one ocean, already rebuilt once from very little, and now found himself on the wrong side of a line that was being drawn through the middle of everything he had built? The loyalist Scots, after the southern campaigns, were that man. Some of them had no good option left. After Yorktown, after the Treaty of Paris, the Loyalists faced a reckoning. Those who had been most openly active could not safely stay. Thousands left for Canada, particularly for Nova Scotia and what would become New Brunswick. Scottish communities took root there that still exist, carrying surnames from the Cape Fear and the Carolina Tidewater. Others went to the Caribbean, to Jamaica and Bermuda, to wherever the Crown could still offer something like protection. They were twice displaced now. Scotland, then America, then the islands. Some of them were old. Some had children who had known no country but the Carolina colony. They packed what they could carry, which was not much, because it was never much. Some stayed. This is the part the histories of the Revolution do not always dwell on. Many loyalists who had not been prominent enough to attract direct retribution simply went quiet, changed nothing, kept farming, kept their heads down, let their children become fully American in the way that the next generation always becomes fully what the new country requires. The grandchildren of those families were simply American, and nobody asked which grandfather had fought which way. That silence is not dishonest. It is how communities rebuild after a civil war. It is how the same community can sit down at the same table once the shooting stops and find a way to keep existing together. Flora MacDonald and her husband left for Scotland in 1778. She had seen enough. The Loyalist cause was lost, the Cape Fear life was over, and Scotland was where what remained of her life would be lived. She was 56. She would live another 12 years in the Highlands, in a house that overlooked the sea she had crossed twice. What she left behind in North Carolina was a community that had to find its own way forward without the framework that had brought many of them there. Some dispersed, some stayed and rebuilt, and their descendants became indistinguishable from the broader Scots-Irish culture around them. The specific Highland Loyalist thread thinned. It did not entirely disappear. The backcountry patriots who had come down from the mountains to fight at King's Mountain returned to their settlements. They had defended what they had built. They had fought under no regular command, elected their own officers, made their own decisions about when to move and when to stop. It was a form of military organization that came directly from the culture, the community making its own choices. The war in the South between 1780 and 1782 was hard in ways that are worth sitting with and not romanticizing. Farms were burned. Livestock was taken. People were killed in their own yards, in their own fields. The violence was intimate in the way that civil violence always is, because the people doing it knew the land and sometimes knew the people they were moving against. Community memory of these years was long. In mountain communities, the specific loyalties of specific families were remembered for generations. The surname that had been on the other side at King's Mountain was still the surname that had been on the other side decades later, when the grandchildren met at a church or a store. These things were not always spoken. They were known. What is honest to say, the Revolution did not find the Scots united. It found them in the same condition emigrants always arrive in, which is uncertain, still sorting out what they owe and to whom, still learning which sky they are standing under. A man twice displaced has a particular difficulty with loyalty as an abstract principle. He has already given loyalty and had the ground shift beneath him. He has already sworn and seen the oath outlast what he swore it for. He knows that belonging is not guaranteed by any instrument. You build it piece by piece in a specific place with specific people, and it lasts only as long as the conditions that made it possible. That knowledge, hard-won, is part of what the Scots brought to America, not cynicism, something more careful than that, a realism about the limits of what any authority can promise, an awareness that the document can be redrawn, the boundary moved, the landlord replaced by a different landlord with the same reach. The backcountry patriots prevailed. Their descendants would carry that Scots-Irish fighting tradition into every subsequent generation. The loyalty that had been given to the patriot cause became loyalty to the Republic, and it ran deep. But it was never the blind loyalty of people who had never been disappointed by authority. It was the loyalty of people who knew exactly what it cost. The loyalist thread was not erased. It simply went quieter, braided into the wider story. It sits in the family Bibles of Nova Scotia, in the graveyards of Jamaica, in the Cape Fear communities that stayed and rebuilt and never quite spoke of which way the family had gone when the choice was forced. Some of the men who fought on opposite sides at King's Mountain are buried in the same county. The ridge where they fought is a national battlefield now. People walk the trail through the same trees, up the same slope. The plaques name both sides with equal plainness. A visitor who did not know the history might not immediately understand that this was not a clean patriot story. It was a much harder one. Let that be the honest shape of it. A revolution that found a people still sorting out where they belonged, an ocean behind them, a new country ahead. The choices made under those conditions were not always the choices that would look cleanest in the history that came after. They were the choices of people doing their best in the middle of something they could not yet see the end of. The mountains held them all, patriot and loyalist, the living and the dead, the ones who stayed and the ones who sailed away again. The ridges did not change. The creek bottoms did not take sides. By the time the shooting stopped and the new republic began, the land was simply itself, as it had always been, indifferent to the decisions made upon it. Rest here a moment with the weight of it. Not all of history is triumphant. Some of it is two men with the same name on opposite sides of a burning fence, making the best sense they can of a world that has come apart. Understanding that does not diminish the ones who chose well. It makes them more real. It makes all of them more real. The chapter we enter now is quieter than the ones before it. No wagon road, no mountain gap, no river crossing in the dark. This is the story of what happened when Scots sat down in candlelit rooms and thought carefully about how a country ought to be organized. It is a chapter about ideas. And ideas travel as lightly as a man can carry them across any distance without losing a single word. Let the pace slow here. These thoughts took years to form. They can be received slowly. You are exactly where you need to be for this. Settle. The first thing to understand is that Scotland in the 1700s was not simply exporting labourers and farmers. It was exporting something that surprised the people who received it, a habit of rigorous thought applied to ordinary life. The Scottish Enlightenment is a phrase that appears in history books and can seem remote, the sort of thing that belongs to universities and footnotes. It was not remote, it was practical. It was asking a simple question: how should people live together and how should they be governed? That question was being asked in Edinburgh coffee houses and Glasgow lecture halls at the same moment that the American colonies were asking it on behalf of an entire new country. The timing was not accidental. It was a conversation. Francis Hutcheson was born in County Down in 1694, the son of a Presbyterian minister. His family had come from Scotland to Ulster in the previous generation. He was, by birth, already the product of one crossing. He went to Glasgow to study and eventually became a professor there. He taught moral philosophy in English rather than Latin, which was unusual and deliberate. He wanted to be understood by ordinary students, not only by specialists. Hutcheson argued that human beings possessed a natural moral sense, that ordinary people, given honest argument and some education, were capable of reasoning their way to decent conclusions. This was not radical in Glasgow. It became foundational in Philadelphia. He wrote that the right to resist unjust authority was not rebellion. It was the exercise of a conscience that answered to reason and to God before it answered to any king. He was writing this in the 1720s and 1730s. The American founders were reading him 30 years later. The ideas moved through the Presbyterian network. Ministers who had studied in Glasgow or Edinburgh carried Hutcheson's arguments with them when they emigrated. They preached versions of them from Carolina pulpits. They quoted them in letters to correspondents in Virginia. By the time Jefferson was drafting what would become the Declaration of Independence, Hutcheson's language about natural rights and the purpose of government had passed through so many intermediaries that the original source was nearly invisible. The scholars have been tracing it ever since. The phrase about the pursuit of happiness carries Hutcheson's fingerprints so clearly that the connection has been noted for 2 centuries. Whether Jefferson was quoting deliberately or had simply absorbed the language through years of reading, the historians still discuss. What they do not dispute is that the connection is real. Thomas Reid came after Hutcheson at Glasgow and developed what he called common sense philosophy. The idea was this: ordinary people, thinking carefully, arrive at reliable conclusions. The senses and the reason are trustworthy. You do not need a philosopher to tell you what you already know to be true. Reid was arguing against skepticism, against the suggestion that nothing could be known with certainty. He was also, in effect, arguing for democracy. If ordinary people could reason reliably, then ordinary people deserved a voice in how they were governed. David Hume and Adam Smith were the thinkers whose names travel furthest from that period. Hume on the nature of knowledge and causation. Smith on how commerce and human sympathy work together to organize a productive society. Benjamin Franklin met Adam Smith in Edinburgh in 1759. The records suggest they spent several evenings in conversation. How much of those conversations found their way into the thinking of the new republic is difficult to trace precisely. That the meeting happened is not in dispute. Smith's Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, the same year as the Declaration. The coincidence has been noted often. The 2 documents were asking related questions. What are the natural rights of individuals, and what are the natural principles that govern how people exchange value? These were not abstractions on the frontier. A backcountry farmer who had crossed an ocean to own his own ground understood very directly what it meant to have rights over the product of your own labor. Smith's arguments arrived in an America that had already been living them. Now the man who carried most of this directly into the founding, John Witherspoon, born in Gifford in East Lothian in 1723, son of a minister, educated at Edinburgh. He was, by his mid-40s, the most prominent Presbyterian minister in Scotland. He arrived in New Jersey in 1768 to lead the College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton University. He had not intended to emigrate. It took years of persuasion and finally his wife's consent before he agreed to go. He took the position seriously enough to cross an ocean for it. Witherspoon was not primarily a philosopher. He was a practical educator. He reorganized the college, expanded its curriculum, and brought to it the Edinburgh model, theology and moral philosophy alongside natural philosophy, law, and rhetoric, all in the same building, studied by the same students. He taught common sense philosophy as a foundation. Every student who came through Princeton under Witherspoon's tenure learned that ordinary reason, applied carefully, was a reliable guide to moral and political truth. This was the intellectual subsoil of the college. The role of students who passed through Princeton between 1768 and the early 1790s is remarkable. One future president, one future vice president, 21 senators, 29 representatives, 12 governors, 56 members of the Continental Congress. These figures are from the historical record, and they need to be held carefully. Witherspoon was not the only influence on any of these men, but he was a common one, and the habits of thought he taught were habits of thought that shaped how they asked questions about governance. Witherspoon himself signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was the only clergyman to do so. He signed it as a minister, as an educator, and as a man who had spent 40 years thinking about what legitimate authority meant and where its limits were. He had strong opinions about those limits. He believed that tyranny was not simply a political problem, it was a moral one. A government that exceeded its mandate was not merely inefficient, it was a violation of the natural order that God had built into human affairs. He had been saying this in Scottish kirks for 20 years before he said it in Philadelphia. His students remembered him as demanding but fair. He pushed them to argue clearly and to think about consequences. He was not interested in clever positions that could not be defended in plain language. This was a Scottish quality, the distrust of ornamentation when substance was what was needed. James Madison sat in Witherspoon's classes. Madison, who would be called the father of the Constitution, was a small, quiet man from Virginia who had come north to Princeton specifically because of its reputation for serious education. What he encountered there was the Scottish Enlightenment made into a curriculum. The checks and balances in the Constitution, the separation of powers, the insistence on mechanisms that would prevent any single person or faction from accumulating too much authority. These ideas had theoretical sources in many places, but they also had a practical source. That practical source was the Presbyterian Kirk. Every Scottish Calvinist knew from experience what an accountable institution looked like. Congregations elected their elders. Ministers were answerable to presbyteries, and presbyteries to general assemblies. No one person held unchecked power. The system assumed that human nature required restraint. The framers of the Constitution were applying this insight to a government. The language was different. The mechanisms were new. But the underlying principle, that power needs to be distributed and checked, was something Scots had been practicing in their church governance for 200 years. Witherspoon made this connection explicit in his lectures. He told his students to observe how the Kirk organized itself and consider what that model suggested about civil government. He was not proposing to impose the Kirk on the state. He was pointing to a working example of accountable governance and saying, look at how that works. The university founders were not only at Princeton. William and Mary had Scottish faculty in its early decades. The College of Philadelphia, which became the University of Pennsylvania, was built in part on Edinburgh models. What would become Columbia was shaped by Scottish-trained educators. The University of Edinburgh was, in the mid-1700s, arguably the finest university in the English-speaking world. Its medical school in particular drew students from the American colonies. Physicians trained at Edinburgh returned to America carrying not only medical knowledge, but the whole intellectual atmosphere of a city that took ideas seriously. A young man from Virginia or Pennsylvania who went to Edinburgh to study medicine came back knowing Hume and Smith and read not as names in a library, but as the texture of the city he had lived in. He had walked the same streets, eaten in the same taverns, attended the same lectures. The parish school instinct travelled too. In Scotland, the Reformation had planted a conviction that the Kirk had a duty to educate its people. The Education Act of 1696 required every parish to maintain a school. The idea was simple. A congregation that could not read scripture for itself was a congregation at the mercy of whoever could. In America, the Scots-Irish who settled the backcountry carried this instinct with them. Before they had built a proper church, many communities had already designated a schoolmaster. The school and the church went up together, sometimes in the same building, sharing walls and a roof, and the same assumption that education was not a luxury but a responsibility. The subscription school was the frontier version of the parish model. Families in a settlement would agree to contribute towards the salary of a teacher and the building of a schoolroom. It was voluntary, imperfect, and remarkably persistent. Families who had very little paid what they could because they believed their children should be able to read. The schoolmaster in many of these communities was a Scot, or the son of one. He had been educated in a tradition that took pedagogy seriously. He taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and often Latin and logic as well, because the Scottish tradition did not see a sharp boundary between basic education and the kind of rigorous thinking that prepared a person for public life. These one-room schoolhouses produced, over generations, the democratic citizenry that the Republic needed. The framers had written a constitution that assumed literate, reasoning voters. The schoolmasters delivered them. The connection between the founding documents and the frontier schoolhouse runs through the parish school tradition of Scotland. Witherspoon at Princeton was not working in isolation. He was part of a network. Scottish ministers in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas corresponded with each other, sent promising students north, recommended books. The intellectual community was real and functioning, distributed across hundreds of miles of colonial geography. The Presbyterian Church in America was, by the time of the Revolution, the largest dissenting denomination in the colonies. Its members were concentrated precisely in the regions, the backcountry, the middle colonies, that provided much of the energy of the Revolution. Its ministers were educated in the Scottish tradition. Its governance was a working model of representative accountability. It is not the whole story of the founding. It was never only Scots in that story. English common law was there. Classical republicanism from Greece and Rome was there. The French Enlightenment was there. What is honest to say is that the Scottish contribution was real, was specific, and ran through institutions rather than only through individuals. It ran through the colleges that trained the framers, through the church governance that modeled accountable institutions, through the philosophy that gave the Declaration its moral language, through the schoolmasters who made the Republic's assumptions about literacy into a practical reality in every valley where Scots-Irish families had settled. 6 of the first 9 governors of the new United States had Scottish or Scots-Irish ancestry. Andrew Jackson's parents had come through Larne from Ulster. James Monroe, James K. Polk, the thread keeps returning in the early ledger of American leadership. A small nation, a long reach. These men did not think of themselves primarily as Scots. They were Americans building something new, but they carried habits of mind that had been formed in Scotland and in the Scottish diaspora. A respect for reasoned argument, a distrust of unchecked authority, a belief that a man should be able to read any document placed before him. That belief had a source. It was not mystical or accidental. It was the product of a tradition that had, for 2 centuries, insisted that literacy was a religious duty and that ordinary people deserved access to the arguments that govern their lives. A parish church in East Lothian, a coffee house on the high street of Edinburgh, a lecture hall at Glasgow, a college in New Jersey, a one-room schoolhouse in the Carolina backcountry. These were the rooms in which a set of ideas moved from one world to another. They were carried by ministers and teachers and the sons of ministers and teachers. They were carried in lecture notes and letters and the conversations of men who had studied together and then scattered across a new country. They were carried in the plain conviction that an ordinary person, given honest argument and the ability to read, was capable of governing themselves. The document was legible. The argument was sound. The schoolmaster had done his work. A small nation had sent its thinking across an ocean, and the ocean had not diminished it. Let that thought settle quietly. The candles in Witherspoon's library, the students bent over their notes. the long, careful work of turning ideas into institutions. It is still there, in the bones of the Republic, patient and unfaded, the way any deep foundation holds. In Chapter 5, The Land Remembers. The frontier did not stay a frontier. That is the first thing to understand. What had been raw country, creek bottoms and ridgelines with no name on any European map became, generation by generation, something that knew the people living in it, and they knew it back. The process was slower than settlement. You could build a cabin in a season, you could clear a field in a year, but the land only began to hold you after the dead were buried in it. That was the true measure. A churchyard is not a dwelling. It is a claim that goes deeper than title. The first grave in the Appalachian settlements were plain, a wooden marker sometimes, a flat stone pulled from the nearest creek, with a name scratched into it by whoever had the patience and the sharpest tool. The lettering was irregular. The dates were sometimes wrong by a year. None of that reduced what the marker meant. The Scots brought their relationship with the dead with them. In Scotland, a kirkyard was not merely a burial ground. It was a place you walked through on an ordinary day, nodded to the familiar names, felt the presence of those who had been in the same valley before you. The dead were neighbors, not frightening, present. In the Carolina backcountry, in the hollows of Tennessee, in the valley settlements of southwest Virginia, the same logic applied. A family buried their first child, their first elder, in a particular spot. They came back to that spot. They buried others near the first. Over decades, the ground acquired a different quality. Sacred is one word for it. Rooted is another. The kirks rose as soon as the communities were stable enough to raise them. Not grand buildings, simple ones, log walls at first with a split plank floor and a stone hearth at one end, plain benches, a pulpit higher than the congregation as the Scottish practice was. No images, the word was enough. The word had always been enough. A congregation gathering in one of those log kirks on a Sunday morning brought everything that had come down the Great Wagon Road with them. The psalms they sang were the Scottish psalms, set to the Scottish tunes. The meter was the old long meter. The precentor lifted the first line, and the congregation echoed it, the way their grandparents had echoed it in Antrim and Ayrshire before that. The ministers preached long. This was not a failing, it was an expectation. A congregation that had been raised in the Scottish Presbyterian tradition expected to be reasoned with, argued at, followed through a text with careful attention to every clause. The sermon was an intellectual event. It was also the community's main event. The church was the center, and the center held. Outside the kirk, after the service, people stayed. Families who had walked 2 hours through the forest were not going to turn around and walk back immediately. The churchyard became a gathering place. News passed. Marriages were arranged. Children ran between the markers. The dead were present, and the living were among them, and it was not strange. It was simply how a community worked. Place names went down like seeds. Every valley, every creek, every ridge that acquired a name acquired a memory along with it. The Scots named what they settled after what they had left, and also after what they found, and sometimes after the people who had been there before them. whose names for the land were already present in the syllables of the rivers. There is a Butte County in North Carolina named for the Earl of Butte, a Scotsman who served as Prime Minister. There is an Ayr in several states. There is a Caledonia and a Glasgow and a Dundee in places scattered across the interior. The names were not nostalgia exactly. They were a way of saying, we were here, and this is where we came from. And alongside those transplanted names were the indigenous names the settlers learned to use, because the rivers had been named before anyone from Scotland or Ireland or England arrived. The Catawba, the Watauga, the Holston, names given by the people who had lived in those valleys since long before the wagon road existed. The records show that settlers adopted these names naturally because the names were accurate. They described the place. The land was not empty when the Scots arrived. This is not a small thing to say, and it should not be said quickly. The Cherokee, the Catawba, the Shawnee, the Creek, these peoples had their own long relationships with the same mountains, the same valleys, the same ridgelines. They had their own names for every place the settlers renamed. The frontier story of the Scots-Irish and the Cherokee is a story of proximity, trade, conflict, and the slow, painful displacement of one people by another. The records do not soften this. There were Scots who married into Cherokee families. There were Scots who fought against Cherokee towns. There were treaties made and treaties broken, almost always broken by the same side. Some Scottish settlers recognized in the Cherokees' attachment to their land something that echoed what had been done to their own families in the Highlands. The attachment was the same, a people who knew every path and every name and every story of a particular piece of ground, and who found that knowing was no protection against dispossession. The parallel was not lost on everyone. The frontier closed behind the settlers the way a door closes quietly behind someone who has passed through it. It did not announce itself. One year there was open country beyond the next ridge, and a few years later there was a family there, and then two families, and then a settlement with a name and a kirk. The wilderness became the backcountry, became the Piedmont, became simply home. The children born in those settlements grew up knowing no other home. This is the generation that matters for what came next. They had not crossed the ocean. They had not walked the Great Wagon Road. They had been born in the cabin their father built, baptized in the log kirk, taught their letters by the same schoolmaster who had taught their older siblings. They knew the mountains the way the Highland children had known their glen, intimately, by name, every path understood, every weather sign readable. The mountains were not strange country to them. They were home in the deepest sense, and that intimacy with a place is something that passes into the character of the people formed by it. It does not go away easily. The fiddle was at the weddings. This is one of the constants in the records, from the earliest frontier settlements through to communities that had been in those mountains for a century. Whatever else changed, the music was there. A frontier wedding was the community's occasion. Everyone came. The dancing went until people could not stand. The tunes were old. Some had names that placed them immediately, reels and strathspeys whose titles were recognizably Scottish. Others had American names by now, names given to them in the mountains, but the modal scales were the same, the rhythm patterns the same, the particular way of leaning into a phrase before releasing it. The fiddle remembered even when the fiddler had forgotten where it learned. The women carried the songs the way they carried the seeds, not as a deliberate act of preservation, simply as the way you cooked, the way you kept house, the way you settled a child. A mother singing to an infant in a mountain cabin in 1780 was singing something her own mother had sung, and her mother before that, the tune arriving with the habit of comfort, not requiring explanation. The ballads had their darkness. This was part of their honesty. A song about a woman waiting for a man who will not return is not a comfortable song, but it is a true one, and the people who sang it understood that truth and comfort are not the same thing. They were Presbyterian. They knew the world was not arranged for easy consolation. The songs did not pretend otherwise. The stories gathered too. Each community accumulated its own history. The first winter, the hard crossing, the family that had not made it through the fever year, the man who had walked back over the mountain to find his wife's grave and returned changed. These stories were told at firesides, passed to children, retold at the community gatherings. They became the founding narrative of a specific place. Craft settled into place. The way a stone wall was laid, the way a roof was finished, the way a chest was jointed at the corners. These techniques had come from Scotland and from Ulster, modified by available materials, adapted to a different climate, but holding their underlying logic. A craftsman from Argyll would have recognized, in the work of his grandson in Kentucky, something familiar in the hands. The herbs changed and also stayed the same. In Scotland, certain plants had been used for certain things for generations. In the mountains, the healers found corresponding plants or used what they had brought or learned from neighbors what the local plants could do. The knowledge of plant medicines, who carried it and how they used it, passed mainly through women, mother to daughter, the same channel as the songs. The language slowed in the mountains, not English. The particular English the Scots-Irish brought with them, with its Scots vowels and its Ulster rhythms and its specific words that had no good equivalents in the standard tongue. Bairn for a small child, wee for something small, dryke for grey weather, and the mountains had dryke weather, so the word was useful and it stayed. The schoolmaster came when the community was ready. Sometimes he was Scottish by birth. More often, by the second generation, he was locally trained. The best student from the previous generation turned to teaching the next. But the model was the same, the parish school idea, which said that every child in the community should be taught to read, regardless of whose child they were. Reading led to arguing, as it always had in the Scottish tradition. The kirk sessions of Appalachian Presbyterian churches were not quiet places. People stood up and made their case and were answered. Discipline was discussed. Doctrine was questioned. Governance decisions were made by vote. A community that had been told for generations that they had the right and the duty to engage with a text brought that habit into every room they entered. The land slowly filled with the names of the dead, not only in churchyards, in the naming of hollows and ridges and creeks. Wilson's Branch, McAllister's Ford, Henderson's Gap. The names recorded specific acts by specific people now gone, a man who first crossed at that point, a family who built there, someone whose story was remembered just long enough to attach to a feature of the landscape, and then forgotten, the name outlasting the narrative. The Grave themselves became history. 3 generations in, a family walking through their churchyard would find stones going back far enough to carry names no one living could remember. A great-great-grandmother from County Antrim. A great-great-grandfather whose stone said simply Scotland, no county given, as if Scotland were precise enough. The children would ask who these people were, and the adults would say what they could, which was never quite everything. Seasons organized the year. Planting and harvest, the same rhythms that had organized life in Scotland and Ulster, with different crops now, different varieties, a different quality of summer heat. But the communal nature of the work persisted. The barn raising, the corn shucking, the quilting, events where the whole community gathered, worked together, and then ate together. The food was American. The practice was older. The mountains held whether the way Highland mountains hold it. A storm could sit on a ridge for 2 days. A fog could fill a valley so completely that the world beyond the clearing ceased to exist. Children growing up in those valleys knew that the outside world was real, but also knew that the valley itself was complete. It did not need the outside world to be enough. The frontier closing meant something different to different people. To the settlers who had come through the Cumberland Gap looking for open country, the arrival of neighbors was usually welcome. Community was the point. But there were always some who kept moving, following the edge of settlement westward, carrying the same habit of beginning over that had brought their people to America in the first place. Those who stayed put down roots that deepened with each generation. A family in the Shenandoah Valley by 1820 might have grandparents buried in the valley, parents who had been born there, children who could not imagine living anywhere else. The roots were real now. The land had received them the way it receives everything that comes to rest in it long enough. The Cherokee were pushed further and further back. The records name the pressure points, the treaties, the land cessions, the periods of conflict, the slow contraction of the territory the Cherokee could call their own. By the early 19th century, the displacement had become systematic policy, not the incidental friction of frontier life. This is part of the same story, and it belongs here, stated plainly. Some of the Scots-Irish families who had lived alongside the Cherokee for generations were among those who watched the removal with unease. A few resisted it in small ways, hid neighbors, bore witness. Most did not, or could not, or had their own interests too closely bound to the outcome. The records are honest about this. History does not simplify. What the land held in the end was everything that had happened in it. The cleared fields and the log kirks and the grave and the boundary stones. The creek names in Cherokee and the ridge names in Scots. The memory of conflict and the memory of coexistence. The land does not choose between these. It holds all of it, the same way old ground holds every layer of what grew and what was buried in it. By the time the frontier had truly closed, by the time the mountains of Appalachia were not the edge of anything but the interior of a settled country, the Scottish character of those communities was deep in the grain of them. It showed in the governance, in the schools, in the churches, in the music that came down every winter evening from the fiddle leaning against the wall. It showed in the faces, in certain hollows, the physical features that had arrived from the north of Britain persisted with a fidelity that surprised later observers. The fair complexion, the particular set of the jaw, features that had no business being in the mountains of western North Carolina, except that someone had carried them there across the water and they had stayed. And it showed in something harder to name, a quality of directness, a particular kind of humor that lands sideways, a distrust of show and a respect for what is actually done rather than what is claimed, a stubbornness in the face of difficulty that does not call itself stubbornness, only persistence, only what anyone would do. These were not invented in the mountains. They arrived there already formed. The generations that came after would move again, west mostly, into Kentucky and Tennessee, and then into the Ohio Valley and beyond, carrying what had been carried, adding to it, losing some of it to distance and time and the necessary business of becoming something new. But a thread ran through it all, even when the thread was invisible. That thread went back to a cold harbour at Belfast Lough, and before that to a glen in Argyll or a borough in Ayrshire or a township in the shadow of Ben Dorain. Back to a person who stood somewhere and made a decision, or had a decision made for them and set out. The land they left gave them their character. The land they found received it. The Appalachian settlements are old now, in the American sense of old. The log kirks were replaced by stone churches, and the stone churches by brick ones. The subscription schools became public schools. The fiddle music went through transformations, old-time, bluegrass, country forms that kept the modal scales and the ornament and the rhythm even as they went by different names. Families still gather in those valleys. The churchyards are still tended. The grave of the original settlers, where they survive, are read with a particular care. A stone with a Scottish surname, a date in the 1770s, a township name from Ulster above that. This is a document. It says someone came here and stayed, and their bones are in this ground. The land remembers in the way that land always remembers, not with words, not with monuments, but with the shape of what is built upon it, and the names attached to it, and the music that came out of it, and the people that came from it. Memory does not require a memorial. It requires continuation, and the continuation is here. The same mountains that received the first settlers are still there. The ridgelines are unchanged. The creeks run the same courses, over the same general beds of stone. The light on a late afternoon in October, coming through a gap in the hills and laying gold across the valley floor. That light fell on the first arrivals and on every generation since, and falls tonight. Let the chapter rest here. The settling in is done. The land has received its people, and the people have given the land their names and their dead and their music. The frontier has closed behind them. What they built is real, and much of it is still standing, and the thread that runs from the Highland Glen to the Appalachian Hollow is intact. Wind DOWNs. The night comes on slowly in these mountains. It always has. The light goes from the ridges last, the high ground holding it after the valley floor has gone to shadow. the same way that highland ridges hold the last of a summer evening. Then the dark is complete, and the stars come out, and the whippoorwill calls from the trees above the cabin. Inside the cabin, the fire has settled to coals. The supper things are cleared. A child is already asleep on a pallet near the hearth, one arm flung out, breathing the slow breath of someone for whom this day was enough. The fiddle leans against the wall. It will be lifted again tomorrow evening. Tonight it rests. Outside, the wood smoke from the chimney goes straight up in the still air. There is no wind tonight. The trees at the clearing's edge are dark shapes against a sky that is extraordinary here. Above the valley, the stars close and many, the Milky Way a soft brightness from ridge to ridge. In Scotland, in a glen that this family's people left 2 generations ago, the same stars are overhead. Later, the earth has turned, but the same stars, the plough, the stars that a grandmother called by their Gaelic names, they do not know they are being seen from 2 continents. They only shine. The mountains on both sides of the ocean are quiet tonight. The ridgelines have their positions and they do not vary. Old stone, worn down over 10,000 years of weather, patient in a way that makes the human span feel brief and also somehow not insignificant. The mountains kept what was brought to them. That is not nothing. Somewhere in this country, a family Bible is in a drawer. The names in it go back further than anyone in the house can account for. A name written in a different ink, a different hand, someone who knew the old country. The Bible is closed. The house is quiet. The name waits in the dark, patient as a mountain, which is to say, indefinitely. A fiddle is propped in a corner of a room in Appalachia. It has been played this evening. The tune was old, older than the player knows, its scales belonging to a musical tradition that arrived in these mountains before the United States existed. The strings are still faintly warm. By morning, they will have cooled to the temperature of the room. The stars above the Appalachian ridge are the same stars that are above the Highland Glen tonight. The same sky, different continents, the same unhurried settling of the world into darkness, the same silence that comes after the day's noise, the same quality of rest that the mountains offer to anything that comes to lie down in their shadow. Tomorrow night there is more to tell, the legacy that traveled further west, the surnames on the map of the whole continent, the thread that runs from the glen to the hollow to the towns and valleys and open country beyond. It is a long story and it has not reached its end, but for now, the night is enough. The glen is dark, the hollow is dark, the wood smoke from 100 cabins and 100 farmhouses on both sides of the ocean has risen and dissolved into the same air. The fire is low, the child is asleep, the fiddle leans against the wall. This is where we leave them tonight, in the good rest that comes after hard work, in a land that knows their name. Good night from Tartan Lullaby. This has been part 2 of the Scots who built America. Part 3 continues tomorrow night. The glen is quiet. The hollow is still. Sleep well. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.